Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some pretty big news today that you've probably seen already if you're staying on top of current events, which I know you are because you're serious about those UPSC exams.
That's right. Always good to stay informed.
Absolutely. So, we're talking about judicial transfers and specifically this recent case with Justice Yashwant Varma being moved to the Allahabad High Court. It's after that recommendation from the Supreme Court Collegium, remember?
Yeah, and it's especially interesting with the whole backdrop of the Delhi High Court Chief Justice wanting that in-house inquiry.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot more to this than just a simple transfer. And that's what we're going to really unpack today.
It's like this one case kind of opens up this whole Pandora's box of questions about how our judiciary works, the structure and all that.
Right, we're going beyond just the headlines here.
Mhm.
Think of this as your super in-depth analysis of the constitutional side of things. Like, what does the Constitution actually say about all this? And we'll look at the major Supreme Court cases that shaped how we see these transfers today.
Definitely. And we can't forget all those debates and criticisms that come up every time a judge gets transferred. There's a lot of back and forth on this.
Oh, for sure. We'll also touch on some of the attempts to reform the whole system because there have been quite a few. You got to remember, this is all about that separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary. Super important stuff for UPSC,
It
right?
couldn't be more crucial.
Okay, so before we get too far, let's just quickly remind ourselves where all of this starts. Article 2222 of the Constitution.
You got it. That's the foundation. Article 22221 basically gives the president the power to transfer a judge from one high court to another. But, and here's the catch, it's got to be after consultation with the Chief Justice of India.
Right, so that consultation part, that's where things get kind of tricky.
Oh, yeah. That little phrase has caused a lot of debate and legal battles over the years. Really shaped how we understand these transfers today.
It's all about how you interpret it, I guess. Like, what does consultation really mean? And that takes us to those all-important judges cases. They're like the cornerstone of all this. The first judges case back in 1981, that's where it all began, right?
Right. So in that case, the Supreme Court took Article 222(1) pretty literally. They said consultation doesn't necessarily mean the Chief Justice has to agree. The executive branch, like the president, still had the final say on transfers.
So it was more about just keeping the Chief Justice in the loop at that point.
Pretty much. So back then, it seemed like the executive branch had the upper hand in deciding which judge went where.
But then things changed, right? With the second judges case in 93, that was a big one.
Huge. Total game changer. That's when the Supreme Court basically flipped its earlier decision.
Wow, okay. So what happened?
Well, first off, that's when they established the Collegium system. It's basically a group of senior judges. And here's the big part. The court decided that the Chief Justice of India's opinion on transfers would be, like, the deciding factor.
Okay, so more power to the Chief Justice.
Exactly. And their reasoning was that transfers should be all about what's best for the public and for making the justice system work better. This was a huge step toward making the judiciary more independent by giving them more control over transfers.
Makes sense. So the judiciary took a stand for its own independence there. And then we have the third judge's case in 1998. Did that change things even further?
It did. It kind of refined the Collegium system. The court said that the Chief Justice should be consulting with the four most senior Supreme Court judges before making a transfer decision.
Okay, so even more input from within the judiciary itself.
Yeah. And they also had to consult with any Supreme Court judge who knew a lot about the high court in question, maybe because they worked there before or something. It was all about getting different viewpoints and making a more informed decision.
So after all these cases, what does the whole transfer process look like now? Like, walk us through it.
All right, so it starts with the Supreme Court Collegium. They get together, discuss potential transfers, and then they put together a recommendation. Then that goes to the union law minister, who takes a look and gives their advice to the prime minister.
So there's still some involvement from the executive branch there.
Right. And then the prime minister sends the whole package, the recommendation, their advice to the president, and finally, if the president agrees, the transfer is officially announced in the Gazette.
Got it. So that's the process. But what about the principles behind it? What are the guiding ideas that are supposed to shape these transfers?
Well, first off, the Chief Justice can't just decide on a transfer out of the blue. They have to consult with other judges and legal experts to make sure it's not just like a random decision based on nothing.
That makes sense. Checks and balances, right?
Right. And another thing, a judge doesn't actually have to agree to be transferred.
Oh, really? So they could be moved even if they don't want to go?
Yep. And that's actually been a big point of contention, lots of debate about whether that's fair.
I could see how that could be controversial.
Definitely. And the last thing is that courts usually don't interfere with transfer decisions unless there's a clear violation of the rules. They kind of try to stay out of it.
So, limited judicial review there.
Exactly. But even with all these principles, the system still gets a lot of criticism.
That's right. People have some pretty strong opinions about it.
Hmm.
What are some of the main concerns that critics bring up?
Well, the International Commission of Jurists, or the ICJ, they've been really vocal about this. They're worried about what they see as growing interference from the executive branch in judicial transfers.
So they're concerned about the executive branch trying to control the judiciary.
Exactly. They say that this trend could threaten the whole idea of an independent judiciary. Like, judges need to be able to do their jobs without feeling pressured by the government.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If judges are constantly worried about being transferred for making unpopular decisions, they might not be as impartial. What else are people criticizing?
There's this big issue of transparency, or rather, the lack of it. A lot of transfer decisions are justified with really vague reasons, like public interest or better administration of justice. But they don't usually go into specifics.
So it's hard to tell if a transfer is really for legitimate reasons or if it's like a punishment for something the judge did.
Exactly. And that lack of transparency creates this whole atmosphere of suspicion, which can make people question the fairness of the system and ultimately undermine faith in the judiciary as a whole.
And the ICJ, do they have any specific ideas about how to fix these problems?
They do. They've actually suggested setting up a judicial council. It would be mostly made up of judges and would be in charge of both appointments and transfers.
Okay, so taking some of that power away from the executive branch.
Right. And the important part is that this council would have to use very clear, objective criteria for making decisions. That way, everything would be out in the open and people could see that things are being done fairly.
Sounds like a good way to address those transparency concerns.
Definitely. It's more in line with international standards for keeping the judiciary independent.
Speaking of which, we can't talk about judicial appointment without bringing up the National Judicial Appointments Commission, the NJJC. That was a pretty big deal. Can you remind us how that whole thing came about?
Yeah, so back in 2014, the government was getting a lot of flack about the Collegium system, especially all this secrecy around how judges were being appointed. There were calls for more transparency and accountability.
Right. People wanted a say in who was getting these powerful positions.
Exactly. So the government decided to try something new. They introduced the NJJC, which was meant to replace the Collegium system entirely.
Okay, so a major overhaul of the system. What was the NJJC supposed to look like?
Well, it was supposed to be this more inclusive body with a wider range of perspectives. The Chief Justice of India would still be the chair, but you'd also have the two most senior Supreme Court judges, the Union Law Minister, and two eminent members from civil society.
So a mix of judges, politicians, and people from outside the legal world.
Right, and to make sure things were balanced, one of those civil society members had to be from a group like the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, minorities, or women. It was all about representation.
It sounds like they were really trying to make it diverse.
Yeah, they wanted to make sure different voices were heard. And to choose those two eminent members, there would be this panel made up of the Chief Justice, the Prime Minister, and the leader of the opposition.
So a pretty high-powered group making that decision.
You bet. And initially, the NJAC got a ton of support, both from politicians and legal experts.
It seemed like everyone was on board.
Pretty much. I mean, the bill sailed through Parliament with almost unanimous support, and then more than enough states ratified it to make it official.
So a pretty clear mandate for change.
Absolutely. But then, of course, the Supreme Court stepped in.
Right, and they weren't too happy about it. What happened?
In 2015, a 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court ruled that the NJAC was actually unconstitutional.
Wait, so all that effort and it just got thrown out.
Okay.
Why?
Well, the majority of the judges, 4 out of 5, said that the NJJC violated the basic structure of the Constitution, specifically the principle of judicial independence. They were worried about the law minister and the two eminent members having too much influence over judicial appointments.
So they thought it gave the executive branch too much power over the judiciary.
Exactly. They argued that judges wouldn't be truly independent if they could be influenced by politicians or people outside the legal system.
It's interesting how the judiciary ultimately defended its own independence there, even though everyone else seemed to be okay with the change. It's a delicate balance for sure. But wasn't there one judge who disagreed with the ruling?
Yeah, Justice Judicial actually wrote a dissenting opinion. He thought the Collegium system was flawed, too secretive, not accountable enough. He felt like the NJJC, even with its potential problems, could have been a way to fix some of those issues.
So he agreed that change was needed, just not in that particular form.
Right. He thought the NJJC could have helped to avoid some of the shady dealings that he thought were going on within the Collegium.
Interesting perspective. So the Supreme Court's decision meant that the Collegium system stayed in place. But, as we've seen, the debate about how to balance judicial independence with transparency and accountability is far from over.
Definitely not. That whole NJJC experiment really highlighted the tension between the different branches of government and the ongoing struggle to find the best way to appoint and transfer judges.
Now, for those of you listening who are prepping for UPSC, why is all this so important? Why should you care about judicial transfers and all these legal battles?
This stuff goes straight to the heart of Indian polity. You need to understand how the judiciary is structured, the powers it has, and how it interacts with the other branches of government. These are fundamental concepts.
It's not just about memorizing articles and case names. It's about understanding how the system actually works in practice.
Exactly. And this whole story about judicial transfers is a perfect example of that. It shows how constitutional principles are interpreted and reinterpreted by the courts, how the judiciary safeguards its own independence, and how all this affects the balance of power in our democracy.
It's like a real-life case study in Indian governance.
Exactly. And for your UPSC exams, this topic could pop up in a bunch of different ways. You might get asked to analyze judicial reforms or explain the separation of powers in an essay. Or you might get a prelims question about Article 222, the 99th Amendment, or one of those landmark judges cases. You got to be ready for anything.
It's all connected. You can't just learn things in isolation.
Right. And I think what's really fascinating about this whole discussion is that something as seemingly procedural as a judge being transferred can actually raise such profound questions about our democracy.
It's a reminder that even the smallest details can have big implications. So let's recap what we covered today. We started with the constitutional basis of judicial transfers in Article 222. Then we went through those 3 judges' cases that really shaped how the system works today.
And we talked about all the criticisms and concerns about transparency and independence.
And of course, the rise and fall of the NJJC, that attempt to overhaul the whole appointment process.
It's been quite a journey, right?
Yeah, and it's not over yet. The debate about how to ensure a truly independent and accountable judiciary in India is still very much alive.
Absolutely.
So as a final thought for you all, think about this. Knowing all that we've discussed today, what do you think would be the ideal system for appointing and transferring judges? Is there a way to strike a balance between giving the judiciary the independence it needs to function fairly and making sure the process is transparent and accountable to the public? It's a tough question with no easy answers.
A lot to consider.
And that's all from us today. We hope you found this deep dive into judicial transfers informative and helpful for your UPSC preparation. And as always, we want to give a shout out to The Hindu, which was our source for all this fascinating information. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses, and leave a comment below with any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in the future.
We love hearing from you.
Keep those brains sharp, keep studying hard, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.